Hello, everyone. Welcome to our virtual book club. My name is Ellie Gettinger, and I am the education director at Jewish Museum Milwaukee. Um, I and we are really excited. Oh, now I understand where I am in the world. We are so excited to have you guys here today, and we are really excited about this particular presentation and this particular book, and being able to talk with Larry Tye about Joe McCarthy. So before we jump into that universe and talk about Larry's book and Joe McCarthy, let's go through a little bit of kind of Zoom 101 here. Please, patience with any technical glitches. We're working from all over with all sorts of different internet speeds and capacities. So things could go wrong. We hope they won't, but we know that you'll be understanding if they do. We ask, if we were in person right now, we'd ask you all to silence your cell phones and make everything okay in that way. What we're going to ask you guys to do is make sure that you're on mute. Use the chat function to answer questions, to ask questions. And this will also be on Facebook, so there'll be questions that are being submitted from there as well. Please, in the Facebook comments, feel free to throw in questions, and my colleague will push them to me on this area for Larry as we go. We also suggest that you put this on speaker view. We'll be highlighting Larry as he's speaking. That way you only get the one big speaker as opposed to the Brady Bunch or Hollywood Squares version, and it'll be a more compelling talk for that reason. That gallery view on most computers is in the upper right-hand corner. When the presentation ends, please feel free, or if you need to leave early, just hit leave program and we'll see you later. And I know many of you have already made a donation to support the program today, but if you haven't had a chance to and you'd like to, please go ahead to jewishmuseummilwaukee.org and you can make a donation, and we appreciate your support. So let's talk about why we were so excited about this presentation. Larry came to us and said, hey, I have a new book out and it's going to be the DNC, and potentially I'm going to be in town. And while it's very clear that no one is in town for the DNC next week, we thought this was such a compelling topic, and it's so related to so many of the things that we do in the museum in a number of ways. As we're looking at Joe McCarthy, one of the big things that comes up for me personally is the Hollywood blacklist. And for my docents who are on the call right now, you will all know that I keep those two things separate, that they don't mix very often, because McCarthy becomes this towering figure that is all encompassing when you talk about the Red Scare. But he had very little, if nothing, to do with the Hollywood blacklist. So I am excited to go in deeper in McCarthy, because when we presented our 2018 exhibit, Blacklist, the Hollywood Red Scare, we really, aside from a quick paragraph to say, this is who Joe McCarthy was, and this was his role in the broader Red Scare, but he didn't really have anything to do with the blacklist. Now we can really engage in that conversation and explore that with Larry and learn more. The other thing, one of our core values at Jewish Museum Milwaukee is taking events of the past and bridging and building context for the present. And I think this is one of those books that will certainly do that. And I'm really excited to hear about Larry's research and to hear the conclusions that he drew as he was writing this book. So now let me introduce Larry Tye. Larry Tye is a New York Times best-selling author who has published numerous books exploring everything from the birth of public relations in his biography on Edward L. Bernays, The Father of Spin, the Jewish renewal underway from Boston to Buenos Aires and homelands, the Black men who worked on George Pullman's railroad sleeping cars and their role in kickstarting the civil rights movement, and how that today gave birth to the African-American middle class in his book, Rising from the Rails. In his book, Shock, he collaborated with Kitty Dukakis to explore ECT, and he drew a portrait of how therapy helped one woman overcome debilitating depression. He's also written 3 other biographies, one on Superman and the people who wrote it, one on Satchel, which is about Satchel Paige and Jim Crow, and finally, Bobby Kennedy, the making of a liberal icon. In addition to his writing, Tye runs the Boston-based Health Coverage Fellowship, which helps the media do a better job reporting on critical issues like public health, mental health, and high-tech medicine, which, as we all know, is an incredible need right now. Tye was an award-winning reporter for the Boston Globe for many years, where his primary beat was medicine. He graduated from Brown University and was a Nieman Fellow at Harvard University in 1993-94, and he's taught journalism at BU, Northeastern, and Tufts. So, without further ado, I am excited to bring Larry Tye into this conversation, and this is going to be kind of a facilitated discussion. Larry, I would love it if you could start by talking about what drew you to this particular topic at this particular time. Why Joe McCarthy and why now?
Sure. So I want to say that I initially wasn't drawn to this particular topic, that the week before the 2016 presidential election, I had signed up to write a very different book, and that was a biography of Barack Obama. And the day after the election, it became clear that we wouldn't know Obama's legacy until the end of the era of Trump, and that a story that I thought was a story of ancient history of 1950s America and a Red Scare that had been born and died back then seemed suddenly very much a story of today. And I want to say actually one other quick thing, which is that I was drawn to write this book in part by people I interviewed for my last book, a biography of Bobby Kennedy. And for that book, I talked to 450 people, but there was only one who was essential, and that was a woman named Ethel Kennedy, Bobby's widow. And at the time that Bobby died, what Gallup, the pollster, told us was the most popular woman in America. And she said something to me that I couldn't get out of my head. She said that Joe McCarthy might be a monster to much of America, but to Bobby and Ethel, he was just plain good fun. Now, there are a lot of adjectives I've heard used to describe Joe McCarthy, but the idea of him being good fun seemed counterintuitive and suggested to me there was a side of him that I didn't understand and that the history books maybe had missed.
So let's go into that a little bit. You wrote, and I think, I'm not sure if many people understand the connection between Bobby Kennedy and Joe McCarthy, because I think we see them as two totally separate figures. Can you describe the intersection between these two and kind of how you see their place in American history?
So intersection is a great word. That Joe McCarthy was on his way on a political trajectory that started out with his running for office the first time when he was a native of Appleton, Wisconsin, and he was running for the local district attorney's office. And he ran not just as a Democrat, but as a New Deal, FDR-loving Democrat, as a very liberal Democrat. And as we know, he ended his life as a conservative icon. Bobby Kennedy started his life as a Joe McCarthy, anti-communist, very Cold War kind of conservative. He was always a Democrat, but started very conservative. And as we all know, he ended his life at his assassination as the iconic American liberal. And at a magical moment in between those 2 points, when one was going from liberal to conservative and the other from conservative to liberal, they crossed paths. And that was when Bobby Kennedy had just graduated from law school. He went to the University of Virginia Law School. He was a mediocre student and finished smack in the middle of his class. And when he was looking for a job, he did what the Kennedys always did of his generation. He went to Papa Joe and said, "I need a job." And Joe Kennedy had given enough money to Joe McCarthy that all he had to do was pick up the phone and say, "McCarthy, hire my son, Bobby." And the next day, Bobby Kennedy had a job. It was as the number 2 person in Joe McCarthy's Senate office. It was the first real job that Bobby Kennedy had ever really had. He stayed for 5.5 months. And while his children would tell you and tell me that it was an asterisk in Bobby's career and it didn't amount to anything, Ethel Kennedy, who is older and wiser and doesn't have to create myths, admitted that this was a formative moment in Bobby's life, formative enough that Ethel and Bobby became pals with Joe McCarthy, formative enough that they would bring their toddler daughter, their firstborn Kathleen, over to see Joe McCarthy, and formative enough that half a century later, Ethel told me that Joe McCarthy was Kathleen's godmother. And when I told that to Kathleen, she started producing the documentation to show that that wasn't true. But it was a close enough relationship that even the mother thought that there was this godfather thing thrown into it.
So, I mean, I think that's one of the things with this story is there's so many elements that are known in terms of McCarthy's legacy. And then there's this kind of undercurrent of what is not known. You had unprecedented access to some archives. And I'd love if you could tell first about those archives, and then also what do you think you gained from those archives that was new as you were exploring McCarthy?
Sure. So there were 3 sets of papers that I had access to that previous biographers hadn't seen. And I think if Ellie were less polite, she would say, why did the world need the 101st biography of Joe McCarthy? And I think these new papers are part of the reason. One is papers that were released before I started my book, but had never really been gone into deeply, were all the transcripts, a full 9,000 pages of records of the closed-door hearings that McCarthy held. We all know about the famous Army McCarthy hearings, but it turns out that 2/3 of the hearings he held, he kicked the press out, he told the public to go take a walk, and he was behind closed doors where nobody could see what he was doing, and now we can see what he was doing. And they show Joe McCarthy unhinged. They show that any pretense of caring about the rights of his witnesses went out the door with the press and public. They show that he held, in violation of every Senate norm, one-man hearings, and they show that in the morning, he conducted the hearings soberly because he was sober. In the afternoon, after his trademark lunch of a hamburger, a raw onion, and plenty of whiskey to wash it all down, he went off the rails. And you didn't want to show up before Joe McCarthy in the afternoon because his fuse was this short. That was one set of papers. A second set of papers were ones that showed up at the head of my driveway one day when I was out for a very early morning walk with my wife and my dog. And she said, what the heck is that box doing in our driveway? And I said, I don't know, but it will be there when we get back from our walk. Well, it turned out that box was papers I had been asking for 2 years. All of McCarthy's medical records from Bethesda Naval Hospital. The most precious record any of us have is a medical record. And for public figures, after 50 years, if they're public enough and if the government thinks it serves a public cause, they can release the medical records. But it's always easiest to say no. And they had always said no, and they've been saying no to me for 2 years. And one day, one official in the Navy had decided that those records ought to be made public. He sent them to me. I was paranoid enough that I called to make sure that somebody wasn't trying to set me up with some false papers. It turned out they were real. It turned out that they showed that Joe McCarthy was an alcoholic for much of his life. And they showed definitively, while the press told us and the coroner told us that Joe McCarthy died of acute hepatitis, the truth is he died of the DTs, of a fever that spiked to 107 degrees, and he died of a direct outgrowth of his alcoholism. And that was something, the disease was stigmatized then, it is stigmatized today, and they simply told a lie. And it's not me saying that, it was a group of medical experts, including the just retired dean of Harvard Medical School and the just retired editor-in-chief of the New England Journal of Medicine, all of whom concluded that the doctors back then weren't telling the truth based on their own records. The third set of records, which are the ones that took me to the wonderful city of Milwaukee, Wisconsin, to a wonderful hotel called the Iron Horse Inn, and to terrific archives at Marquette University, were all the personal and professional papers from Joe McCarthy. His widow left them 60 years ago. She said they will become public either when our infant daughter dies, and she is now younger than I am and healthier than I am and showing no sign of dying. So that wasn't the way I was ever going to get to see them. Or when she says yes. And she had been saying no for so long to so many people that I had given up. And exactly 1 week after I told my publisher we're never going to get to see those records, I got an email from the wonderful archivist at Marquette saying, if you want to, you're getting to see those records. And it was a strange kind of approval that I got. It was the approval, you can come in and we will unlock the records for you, but the day you stop looking, they go back under lock and key. And those showed very briefly everything from his love letters to his wife, Jean, to all kinds of documents stamped top secret that were leaked to him by the FBI and the CIA, to me, one of the most interesting set of documents were his real-time handwritten World War II diaries, written when he was on a South Pacific island and showing shockingly that McCarthy was actually telling the truth about a critical chapter of his life, that he was the tail gunner Joe that he described himself as when he ran for Senate, and that he was a legitimate war hero, which very few people in Wisconsin seemed to believe back then.
So do you have any idea why she said yes to you after all of these years?
So Ellie, I have a clear idea of a reason that it wasn't. And for anybody that knows me, they will know it's not because I was charming. It may be, and I think it could very well have been, because I was enough of a pain in the neck that the only way to get rid of me was to say, yeah, now go away. Or it may be because I had as an ally a wonderful journalist whose father was Joe McCarthy's best friend, a woman named Greta Van Susteren. And she had had contact with the family. She was arguing the case on my behalf. She had given up at the same time that I gave up that it was ever going to happen. And she was possibly the only person other than me and the archivist at Marquette who was convinced that she would retire before anybody but her ever got to see those papers. The only other person who was more delighted when I did get to see them was Greta.
So as you were crafting this kind of narrative, and you said, you know, there are a lot of books about Joe McCarthy. What were the ways in which you started thinking, you know, and taking this new information and synthesizing? What were the things that emerged that were that kind of showed this new difference in trajectory, you know, aside from, yeah, he is a war hero, which is funny because Wisconsinites tend to take things at face value, but that even at the time there was a lot of questions about his war record. So I think it's interesting that there was kind of this push-pull. And how does this fit into your kind of sense of America and, as you say in your preference, its love of bullies?
Yes. So my book is called, instead of being called McCarthy, it's called Demagogue, because this is a biography front and center of a guy who became known back then as Low Blow Joe McCarthy. On the other hand, it's a look, and one that I think is more important in a way in terms of our history. Every biography that anybody writes, if it's worth reading, is about more than just their single story. You know, whether you're Satchel Paige, the greatest pitcher ever to pitch a baseball, or Bobby Kennedy, the iconic American liberal that I think that liberals in America are still looking to replicate, as interesting as they are, Satchel Paige's story is also a story of Jim Crow America. He happened to have been born the year Jim Crow laws were passed in his native Alabama, and his life is a wonderful lens into Jim Crow, and it's a way of getting young kids to read a book about Jim Crow by disguising it as a book about a great baseball player. Bobby Kennedy's life is about how America changed from the 1950s into the 1960s. And Joe McCarthy's life is a look at America's long love affair with bullies. From our earliest days back to the founding fathers, through people like Huey Long, the dictator, senator, governor from Louisiana, and the Jew-baiting radio preacher named Father Charles Coughlin, the ultimate anti-Semite, on to George Wallace and David Duke. We have a long history of these demagogues, and Joe McCarthy is the archetypal demagogue. He's the one who embodied everything that came before and who set the playbook for everything that came after. And you asked what I saw that was new in all these papers. And the truth is, if I couldn't find something new with all the materials I had, then shame on me. And one of the things I found was that occasionally this extraordinary embellisher and liar, Joe McCarthy, was telling the truth. And that was true about his war record, and nobody believed him, which gives us a sense of the lesson. If you lie often enough, on the rare occasion when you're telling the truth, we don't and shouldn't probably believe you. But if I found some things that made him look better than we thought he was in our history books, most of what I found made him look even more sinister. He trampled on people's rights in a way that was despicable and that extracted a price. I have a whole chapter called The Enablers, and that looked at all the people who let McCarthy happen. That meant, we can see now in these new records, the money that Texas oil men gave to him, and they used to call him the third senator from Texas. We can see now how his fellow senators, and not just the Republicans, but the Democrats, were afraid to take on Joe McCarthy. We can see that our World War II hero and then President Dwight Eisenhower was the enabler in chief, that his brother Milton whispered in Dwight's ear from the day Eisenhower took office, take down that Wisconsin bully, Joe McCarthy, and Eisenhower waited a year and a half to do it. More importantly, what my research showed was that people paid a real price for Joe McCarthy's bullying and demagoguery. And I found nearly a dozen cases, including of 2 US senators who actually killed themselves in a way that we have as convincing evidence as you can because of Joe McCarthy. And one of the people I interviewed, a Wisconsinite, shortly before he died, was a guy named Bronson LaFollette. And I don't know if you all remember who he was. He was the son of young Bob LaFollette, the senator. He was the grandson of fighting Bob LaFollette, the senator, part of your dynasty of LaFollettes, who I think mean to you what the Kennedys meant to us in Massachusetts. And Bronson said, the call from Joe McCarthy that warned my dad that he might be called in front of McCarthy to explain whether he had communists on his Senate staff is what led my father to take a gun, put it to his head, and end his life. And I heard those same kinds of stories time and again in a way that made me realize that demagogues aren't a momentary nuisance. They are a deadly threat to our country. And I think I'm going to stop. I'm sorry for wandering on so long.
No, I think that's an interesting, because I think when we think about a demagogue, we think about the kind of erosion of rights, we think about that kind of broader sense, but that individuals are impacted too, that in those big numbers, in those big scope questions, that there are individuals, and sometimes very powerful individuals, who feel like they're powerless in the face of that bullying. And it's a really interesting point. His entry into the realm of red baiting is kind of late in terms of the national scene. A lot had been happening throughout the post-war World War II period by a number of different organizations. And I believe in your book, you say, you know, all of the big spies, all of the big stuff had already been done by the time he's making his speech in 1950. So can you describe his kind of entry into this realm? Why, you know, yes, it was effective, but what were the kind of motivations? And then why he becomes synonymous with it?
Sure. So I can do that by taking you, if you'll all indulge me and come for a brief trip with me on February 9th, 1950, to a place that McCarthy's staff called Wheeling, West by God, Virginia. And they called it that because this was not exactly where a prominent US senator would want to have gone for the Lincoln Day dinner speech in 1950. But Joe McCarthy wasn't a prominent US senator. He was a backbencher. He looked like you in Wisconsin were about to kick him out of office. And he was desperate in February of 1950 for an issue to grab onto. Prominent Republicans got invited for the Lincoln Day dinner in New York or Boston, in Milwaukee, or maybe Chicago. Joe McCarthy got invited to Wheeling, which was a sign of how desperate they were and how desperate he was. He shows up that night in Wheeling with a briefcase with two speeches. One speech was about national housing policy, a true snoozer of a speech. Had he picked that speech out of the briefcase that night, we would not be here 70 years later talking about Joe McCarthy. He would have been a one-term senator. Nobody would have remembered him, and he would have disappeared in history. Instead, he reached deep into his briefcase and pulled out a second speech, and that was a barn burner. He held in his hand a document and said, "I'm holding in my hand a document, and this has the names of 205 spies in the US State Department. These are names known to President Harry Truman. They're people he should have weeded out of our government, and they pose a real threat to America." Now, McCarthy was brilliant at understanding just how scared Americans were back in February of 1950. Nationalist China had recently become Red China. We had already caught, tried, and convicted the atomic spies Ethel and Julius Rosenberg. And does anybody there, and you could put up your hand, if you remember something called duck and cover? Great, so you remember what duck and cover was. Duck and cover was something extraordinary where we were told all you have to do is put your hands over your head and duck under your desk, and if there's a nuclear explosion, you'll be all set because you're under your desk after all and your hands are over your head. McCarthy understood those fears and he played on them in a shameless way. He told us that he was able to count and name these spies who were putting us at risk. He told us that he was going to ensure that they were rooted out. Now, what he actually had in his hand that night, nobody is quite sure. What we are sure is it wasn't 205 names. It wasn't a list of real spies at the State Department because, as Elise said, all the 24 carat spies had already been rooted out. It wasn't even certain that his real number was 205 because in the next week, it changed from 205 to 207 to 57. And 57 was my favorite number because the speculation was that Joe McCarthy, who liked nothing better than a good steak or a hamburger, had stopped in on his way to Wheeling, had some Heinz 57 sauce in fancying up whatever cut of meat he was having that night, and that number somehow stuck in his head. It didn't matter. Joe McCarthy had his issue. Joe McCarthy had his position on the front page of every newspaper in America, and Joe McCarthy never looked back.
So this becomes, instead of being Joe McCarthy also ran one-time senator, he's suddenly Joe McCarthy political force. He leverages this into a chairmanship. How does he, and it is one of these kind of random, he heads the Senate subcommittee on permanent investigations, which sounds like a fake thing. How does he leverage that so quickly? And then what is the kind of tools that he wields as the Senate committee chairman?
So you characterize it just right. He takes an obscure committee and an even more obscure subcommittee that he is suddenly the chair of in the Eisenhower landslide of 1952. And in January 1953, he basically says to the world, watch out, I'm going to do something really special here. And the special thing was to convert legitimate anti-communism into a red-baiting, reckless accusation guilt by accusation that transforms his name from being the name of a proud Appleton Grand Chute farming family, part Irish, part German, and he suddenly converts their name into an ism that survives him by 50 years and counting. And he does that by holding the one-man hearings we talked about. He does it by ignoring any Senate protocol or any decent behavior. He does it by embellishing and then realizing that a big lie makes you suffer no more than a small lie, and that you can fool most of the people much of the time. And he does it in a way that by 1954, the start of 1954, just a year into this new chairmanship, Joe McCarthy is the second most popular public figure in America. So it may make you feel better in Wisconsin that he wasn't just your mistake, he was everybody's mistake. The only public figure as of the start of 1954 who was more popular in America was the war hero president that we talked about, Dwight Eisenhower. And Eisenhower was intimidated by McCarthy. So it was not a pleasant situation to start that year of 1954. But as we can talk about, it changed very quickly.
Yeah, so let's get into that quickly, and then because I definitely want to hear about how he kind of utilized the Jewish community and how he leveraged both anti-Jewish rhetoric and homophobia as well. So can we get into his demise and that pieces in one question? Is that possible?
We can. And so I'd like to start with the second half of that. Joe McCarthy had a number of targets when he was a senator. We all know that he was anti-red and anti-pinko. You may know, or you may not know, that he also was part of fueling what was called the Lavender Scare, that he went after gays in the government, and he said that he was doing that because gays were a security risk, that if a Russian spy who was in America recruiting spies knew that somebody was gay and they worked at the State Department or they worked at the White House, they'd be vulnerable. This Russian recruiter would have leverage. The irony in that was that if anybody was vulnerable, it was Joe McCarthy. He was a gambler, he was a drinker, he had vices that put him at risk for giving Russian recruiters leverage. But Joe McCarthy ignored that. Joe McCarthy and his young aide, a brilliant, arrogant lawyer named Roy Marcus Cohn from New York, who was gay, had no problem going after gays. And Roy Cohn, so call him a hypocrite, he didn't care. He was denying forever, including when he died of AIDS, that he was gay. They went after gays. You may know that McCarthy was also anti-Eastern elitist. And what that meant was Wall Street, and what that meant was schools like Harvard, and what that meant was anybody who wasn't a proud, salt of the earth Midwesterner like Joe McCarthy. What you may or may not know was that he was also an anti-Semite. And my evidence for that starts with maybe the first time McCarthy inserted himself in a public debate, and that was a debate over something that probably everybody has forgotten if they ever knew about it. It was the so-called Malmody Massacre. This was at the beginning of the Battle of the Bulge. It was the bloodiest massacre of American soldiers during World War II. Outside of this tiny village of Malmedy in Belgium, a bunch of Americans were overwhelmed in the German sweep at the beginning of the Battle of the Bulge. They held up their white flags of surrender, and the Germans responded to that. An SS Panzer unit responded to that by machine gunning some of them, by killing others with their butts of their rifles, and anybody who escaped to a nearby cafe was burned out. After the war, as part of the famous Nuremberg trials, Americans tracked down the perpetrators, tried them, convicted them, sentenced them to death. A year or so later, a bunch of pacifists, a bunch of ex-Nazis, and one US senator said, "Oh, you mistreated those poor SS Panzer guys. the prosecutors, and especially the Jewish prosecutors, used intimidation to confess, to make them confess, and we should retry them. We should relook at this whole thing. Well, none of that was really true. The US Senate came in and investigated and said, McCarthy, you have it all wrong. Now, I could say to you that that was just a case of an overzealous senator. I could say to you it was him playing to his German constituents, although that would be disparaging the German constituents who don't deserve that. But if that was the only thing that McCarthy did that made me think he was an anti-Semite, my evidence would be thin. My evidence is also that he used slur words like heeb and like a word that you may or may not remember, sheeny. I don't know if anybody is familiar with that, but that is an anti-Semitic slur. He used that when he was in the privacy of his friends, and his friends repeated that years later. You can also trust much more than me the Anti-Defamation League, which came in and investigated McCarthy's charges against the US Army. And they said, something smells rotten. The idea that 25% of the employees at the base he was targeting were Jewish, but something like 75% of his targets were Jewish doesn't smell right. There was evidence everywhere. My last piece of evidence is a very small one, but to me, maybe the most telling of all. Joe McCarthy hired, as I mentioned, as his chief of staff, as the one guy more senior than Bobby Kennedy in his office, this lawyer named Roy Marcus Cohn, a Jewish lawyer from New York. So how could he have been an anti-Semite if he had Roy Cohn? Right. Well, McCarthy told every friend of his, I hired that Jewish lawyer because I'm being attacked as being an anti-Semite, and that gives me cover. It was a fig leaf. And I think that while I don't want to be guilty of the slurring by association that Joe McCarthy is guilty of, I think that Joe McCarthy was an anti-Semite. I wrote that, and if you read my book, you can decide whether my evidence was right or wrong. But I think that he went after Jews for the same reason that he went after gays and Reds, which is they made an easy target in the 1950s, and they played to his demagogic, bullying image.
Before, did the Jewish community have any kind of broader response as they to McCarthy, or was there such a sense of fear of him, of his power, that they just kind of let it go? Like, how was there any kind of organized Jewish response? You mentioned the ADL.
Yes. No. So the answer is yes and yes. There was a response, and the much more important than the ADL response and the response of other organized Jewish organizations was the response of Jews in the broader community. And every poll done of McCarthy's political support showed that he had the least support in the Jewish community, and that Jews saw through him quicker than much of America did. And was there a sense of being afraid? Absolutely. It was just after World War II. Jews knew what happened when they stuck their necks out on things like that. And it was not a moment where the Jewish community, in an organized way or in an individual way, wanted to take a risk of going after the second most popular political figure in America. So the idea that they did that in their voting behaviors and in their explanations to pollsters, I see as a moment of bravery.
And, you know, McCarthy has this meteoric rise and almost just as quick, maybe even quicker, a fall. Can you go into that a little bit? I mean, I think a lot of people have memories of watching the Army McCarthy hearings. When I talk to my docents and to groups, they'll say this is the first thing they can kind of remember seeing on TV. How does this shape American consciousness, and how quickly does he fall?
Yes, so it's the beginning in 1954. Joe McCarthy has taken on the Army, which is an enemy too big to bully. It's one thing to go after the State Department or the Voice of America. People don't care much about that. There's no more democratic institution in America than the armed services. He was saying there were spies in the Army. The Army initially caved into him, and finally, by early 1954, it developed a backbone. It said, Joe McCarthy, your names and numbers aren't good, and we're going to stand up. We're also going to stand up against your asking for special treatment for Roy Cohn's sidekick, a private named G. David Shine, who McCarthy was asking for all kinds of special treatment for. The Senate holds a set of hearings, the most famous hearings and well-attended hearings in American history to that point, that became known as the Army McCarthy hearings. McCarthy goes into those hearings with a full 50% of America supporting him. By the middle of the hearings, there's a very famous moment. A young, I'm sorry, not so young, lawyer from Boston, a leprechaun-like guy named Joe Welch, asks what may be the most famous question ever asked by a lawyer in American history. It is, have you no sense of decency, Senator? At long last, have you no sense of decency? Those were interesting remarks. They looked like they were spontaneous, that Welch was defending a young associate that McCarthy was saying was associated with a communist group. In fact, Welch had those remarks, that question in his pocket, ready to use it at whatever moment that he knew would turn up where McCarthy showed that he had no sense of decency. And you could be guaranteed with Joe McCarthy that that moment would come early and often, and it did. And Welch picked a moment, looked like it was spontaneous. He was as good an actor as he was a lawyer. But it wasn't his question that turned things around. I think the real story is that by that moment, midway through the hearings, America had gotten a chance for months to watch night after night their supposed champion look more like a town bully. And all of America, I think, wanted to ask that question, have you no decency, by that moment. So Joe Welch asked it, America went along with it. By the end of the hearings, that 50% popularity was down to 34%. Suddenly, all of his fellow senators who had no courage in standing up to a 50% Joe McCarthy were willing to take on a 34% Joe McCarthy. That December, the Senate took a very rare step. The sixth, or maybe it was the seventh time in American history that they censured one of their own. McCarthy was, for all political purposes, dead in December of 1954. He lived till the middle of 1957. He was by that time a broken man. He was by that time not just a heavy drinker, but a fifth-a-day drinker. And it was very tragic what happened at the end of Joe McCarthy's life.
So we're going to move to some of the questions from our audience. This one is from Facebook. It's from an English teacher, and actually my comments just went up in Milwaukee. And she says, I'm a high school English teacher in Milwaukee, and I teach the Crucible every year. Why do you think McCarthy looms so large in our American consciousness? How much bio do you think is necessary to fully grasp the Crucible?
So I think 502 pages of bio is necessary. And the so actually I think that that the reason McCarthy became this symbol was not because he was the first and not because he was the most accurate red hunter out there. It was because he was the biggest cowboy. And he was the one who, saying there were traitors in our government was one thing, and that was sort of passé. Joe McCarthy understood if you came along and named the traitors, even if your names weren't right, and you counted them, even if your count changed all the time, that was more dramatic. He understood how to play journalists like me. He understood that what we wanted more than anything in the world was to be on page one, and he put journalists on page one just about every day if you were following him. He was this colorful, charismatic character. It wasn't, as I said at the beginning, just Wisconsin who bought him. It was all of us. And he became the embodiment. If we were doing the naming of the movement teleologically or historically, we would be calling the movement Dyeism after the chairman of the House Un-American Activities, or Trumanism after Harry Truman, who made every government employee take a crazy loyalty test, but instead we're naming it after the guy who was the most able to capture our imagination, and that's why it's McCarthyism.
So one of our viewers says, as an archivist listening today, I would love to know more about your research process. Is it similar to Robert Caro? I mean, as you're describing 9,000
yes.
How do you get through all of this? How do you kind of document? How do you take notes?
So I love being mentioned in the same breath as Robert Caro, because he was the guy whose book way back when, 25,000 page book called The Power Broker, was what convinced me that biography was an extraordinary way to tell a story. And everybody's process is very different. I did, as you mentioned in the introduction, a very long time ago, I did a wonderful year-long fellowship program called the Neiman. And 12 American, 12 overseas journalists come for a year to Harvard. And one of our speakers at a seminar was a brilliant journalist turned author named David Halberstam. And David Halberstam brought into that lecture a very thick pile of notes, and it was the notes for his next book. And he let all of us pour through his notes. And the point in doing that was to show us that the notes for writing a book are exactly the same form that the notes for writing that day's or the next day's journalism story. That you go out and talk to people, you write down and then write up what they said, and there's a very straightforward process. The big challenge that you as an archivist know, and that anybody who's tried to write a book knows, is not how to do the interviews, not how to go through the process of fashioning a story. It's what to do when you print out your notes, like I did for McCarthy and for Bobby Kennedy, and you end up with 10,000 pages of printed notes. What do you do with those? How do you make sense out of them? And the answer is every author has their own technique. Mine is to go through with a yellow underliner and a red pen and underline the things that I think are important and ought to be in my book. And then with the big red pen, mark what chapter they belong in. So instead of starting chapter 1 and having 10,000 pages, I may have just 1,000 pages to deal with. But making sense of an enormous amount of archival material and then an enormous number of your own pages of notes is a huge challenge. And 8 books into it, I'm just beginning to understand how to meet that challenge.
Do you think that McCarthy would have lasted longer had he not destroyed himself with his alcoholism?
So he might very well have. Who knows what would have happened? I think unfettered by alcohol, he might have made more sense. Unfettered by alcohol, he could have ended up being a scarier figure and be less encumbered and not have had the topple that we described in topple as opposed to tipple that we described in 1954. But I want to say that I want to go beyond the question and just answer a question that I can't help answering. And it's more political than anybody ever wants to get into. But the assumption is that McCarthy died in 1957, and he did. And I didn't have to dig up the grave in Appleton to know that. But as we all know, McCarthyism didn't die with Joe McCarthy. And my book mentioned the 45th president only in the preface and in the epilogue. But every page of Joe McCarthy's story makes clear that there are people in our country today who are using Joe McCarthy's playbook in a way that is not just coincidental or accidental. And I think that we can't talk about Joe McCarthy without saying that that is the case and without realizing that there are dangers today that make this the story of today. And I want you to indulge me. I want to read I think that it's terrible when people give a talk and read anything, but I want to read you just 2 quotes that make the case that I just made more convincingly than I can make it. And one is a quote, maybe the most famous single quote from the 2016 presidential election. And you may remember this. Donald Trump, who was candidate Trump then, boasted to his supporters in 2016, and I quote, I could stand in the middle of Fifth Avenue and shoot somebody and I wouldn't lose any voters. End of quote. 62 years before that, 62 years, George Gallup, the polling pioneer, predicted this about Joe McCarthy's supporters. Even if it were known that McCarthy had killed 5 innocent children, they, meaning McCarthy supporters, would probably still go along with him. Now, to me, the similarity between what Joe McCarthy looked like in the 1950s and what Donald Trump has done with his supporters in the 2015 to 20 period is more than coincidental. And it's more than coincidental in part because we have a flesh and blood through line. Joe McCarthy's protege, Roy Cohn, 50 years later, was Donald Trump's tutor. Fred Trump and Donald Trump decided in the 1980s that when Donald was entering this cutthroat world of New York real estate, he needed somebody who could show him how to deal with that cutthroat environment. And the guy he picked smartly and rightfully was Roy Cohn, who passed on every lesson that he learned from Joe McCarthy to Donald Trump. And we see that today. And sorry for my diatribe.
No, I always think that's such an interesting link. We actually have a question specifically about Roy Cohn and the Army McCarthy hearings. This is from a Facebook viewer. He says, in the documentary, Where's My Roy Cohn? It presents the Army McCarthy hearings as being shot through with subtle homophobia by the Army side, implying that Cohn's strange relationship with David Schein was known. Why would McCarthy stick by Cohn, Jewish and apparently known to be gay? Was there any evidence that McCarthy himself was deeply in the closet?
So in answering that question, again, I don't want to borrow Joe McCarthy's techniques. The FBI investigated perpetual charges that Joe McCarthy was gay, and they found no evidence of it. There was discussion in the press back then and whispering in the halls of Congress that David Schein and Roy Cohn were lovers, but I have no evidence of that. So all I can say is the one thing I do know was that Joe McCarthy depended on Roy Cohn enough that no matter what Roy Cohn did, Joe McCarthy stuck by him. I can say that Roy Cohn was enough of a hypocrite and a cynic that he went after gays when he was gay and stayed in the closet when he could have helped destigmatize being gay in a way that would have made a real difference back then. But beyond that, I don't want to speculate. There are people who speculated, and if you want to read their speculation, there's plenty of stuff out there, but I can say the best evidence that we have, including FBI reports and Joe McCarthy's own files, give me no confidence in saying that Joe McCarthy was gay or that even Roy Cohn and David Schein were lovers.
Interesting. Just as and this goes back to kind of our conversation on anti-Semitism and anti-communism, one of our viewers commented that she remembered seeing a bumper sticker in 1969 that said Christ or communism. And at that time, it made no sense till she began exploring the kind of anti-Semitic truth to that. So how much of anti-communism in general is kind of looped into kind of this sense of, well, and actually we can even throw the gay piece in there. There's a gay Jewish commie subplot that was happening in America. Throw it all together.
In fairness, I want to say that every faith was worried back then about whether they had to be anti-communist just to show that they were pro-American. Catholics were went through torturous anti-Catholicism, and I think that one of the reasons that the Catholic Church, in terms of the hierarchy, was so strongly anti-communist was not just because they believed that, but because they believed that they had to go 2 extra steps in showing that they were loyal Americans and that they weren't somehow loyal to the Pope and I think that even Protestants who were running things back then and maybe still today felt a certain pressure to show that they were true blue Americans by showing that they were true blue anti-communists. And certainly that was true of Jews, and certainly there was a mixing up of all of these McCarthy enemies to make it that Reds were Jews, were gays, and they were all part of the same Eastern establishment that McCarthy hated. I want to just say one last thing about that, which is one of the great ironies of Joe McCarthy is that he did more damage, I think, and more importantly, than prominent anti-communists thought, that he did more damage to anti-communists than he did to pro-communists in the 1950s. That anti-communists suffered tremendously by Joe McCarthy pointing fingers at specters that didn't exist. And when they were pointing fingers at true red spies, nobody believed them. They just said, you're a McCarthyite and you're just making this up. So he was dangerous to just about everybody, and it took just about everybody much too long to realize that.
So as we're wrapping up today, are there any kind of final thoughts that you'd like to share with our group?
Yes, so I want to share a thought of linking Joe McCarthy and the story about arguably one of the bleakest public figures in our history to say counterintuitively that my book is a good news story. And the good news is that every demagogue in American history, given the rope, has hung themselves. The good news is that given the time, with every bully and demagogue who's gotten to a prominent position in public life in America, Americans have rediscovered our better nature and seen through them and tossed them out. So I think that the story of demagogues is partly a story of warning that we should beware of them, but also of having confidence that we will beware of them. And I want to end on two self-serving notes. I would never be presumptuous enough, and it would be impolite of me to tell you to buy my book. But I do want to say, if you buy my book, buy it from Ellie and her colleagues at the museum, because they get a cut of it. And if you buy the book and you want a signature, I wish I was there in person today and able to sign books. But if you want a signature, tell Ellie that you want a signature, and I will mail her personalized signature plates for you. And the last self-serving thing I want to say, when you get nearer to the end of the year and you start thinking about the big donations you ought to make, cut a check to her museum, because it's a great museum. And thank you for being an attentive audience today.
I'm going to have Larry end every program for me, because
Okay.
that is way better case than I could ever make. So thank you. And actually, you can go. We just launched an online bookstore. It should make it super easy. We do have some signed copies already, but we can add Larry's book plate into that. So please go ahead and buy a book there. Thank you. And I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Jenny Cassie, to talk about kind of the JCRC, who are our fabulous co-sponsors of this program.
Thank you, Ellie, and thank you so much for hosting this event, and Larry for not only your book and amazing research and sharing that amazing story and coming on here today. So as Ellie mentioned, I'm the director of the Jewish Community Relations Council, co-sponsoring this event today. And what we do, amongst the many other community bridge building things in the community, is intake anti-Semitic events and respond to them. And so Larry, the discussion that you had about McCarthy's anti-Semitic roots, and also him pointing to the State Department and looking more specifically at Jewish individuals are things that we call out today as well, to make sure that when any dog whistle type rhetoric is thrown out in the community, specifically Milwaukee, that we are calling it out, we are educating folks about it, and we are responding appropriately. So just as a plug for the JCRC, as I mentioned, we do take in those incidents every year throughout the state of Wisconsin. So if you or someone you know does suffer an anti-Semitic incident, please do reach out to us, and I'll drop our information in the chat. So thank you all for coming today, and it was great to be part of this discussion.
Thank you so much, Jenny. Thank you so much to the Jewish Community Relations Council for all you do. Thank you, Larry. This was wonderful. I so appreciated the breadth of your knowledge and how much you were able to fit into our very tight conversation today. I want to promote a couple of upcoming programs that we have. We're continuing our virtual book club next month on September 9th with an author named Libby Garland. She is going to be talking about her book, The Lost Family, How DNA Testing is Upending Who We Are. And for all of you who've done your 23andMe or your Ancestry.com and you've found some really interesting and strange and new and different things that have changed the way you think about yourself and your Jewish identity, this is a book that explores that. And I think it's going to be a fascinating conversation about how this is shifting the way we understand ourselves within the Jewish community. The next part of this is our second installation of our Global Passport series, and this time we're off to London. So you can travel the world without leaving your couch, and we're going to be doing a virtual tour with the engagement officer from the Jewish Museum London, and it's going to be amazing. They have a mikveh there from, I think, the 11th century. Pretty cool. Thank you all for coming. Again, check the chat for all of these pieces, donations, buy the book, which we have available, and it is an excellent read. And thank you guys for supporting Jewish Museum Milwaukee. We so appreciate you being part of our universe.